having that release of Nick. And as you know, Nicholas Lardy, the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow here at the Institute, is the U.S.'s best analyst of the Chinese economy. And so I urge you all to tune in for that. That's enough preview. I just want to get across to those of you around the world who are watching and those of you who are with us today, there's a lot for you to engage with. We view this as the critical issue of our time, obviously, but we also view WTO, BRI initiatives as things that have to be seen in an economically analytical way and in a broader context, not just as a dispute. In that spirit, let me turn to my friend Haiming Wang to give some introductory remarks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth CL40 PIIE China Economic Forum. Firstly, I want to thank Adam and other PIIE colleagues for making this happen. It's great to be back in this nice Burgertown conference room. It's great to see old friends and welcome new friends. For those of you not familiar with us, CL40 is a leading independent think tank in China. We focus on the China's macroeconomy and financial reform. CL40 began in 2008. It was a platform for policy discussion. Now, we, based on 40 members around 40 years old, we have over 300 members from government, academia, and industry. Today, we are glad to have CL40 advisors, CL40 members, and CL40 full-time senior fellows with us. Our cooperation with PIIE can be traced back to 8 years ago. We worked together on the most important bilateral issues. Last January, as I said, we delivered the first joint report here on China's financial opening. Tomorrow morning, we will have another symposium in New York and deliver the second joint report. It's about building a modern financial system, a very important issue in China. Today, China-US economic relationship has come to a crossroads. Facing trade conflicts, the two countries should better cooperate, and leading think tanks, CL40 and PIIE, will work together to deal with the challenges. So I look forward to hearing your views on these issues. I wish today's conference a great success. Thank you.
During the daytime in Washington, especially when there's a government furlough, we don't do the toasting that such opening remarks would usually be accompanied by in China. We look forward to doing that with our CF40 colleagues next time. I'd like to ask first Xiaogang to give his presentation, and then immediately following Carolyn Freund, and then we will have them up on stage for on-the-record Q&A.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I have a great honor to be here to present. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Adam Paulson
and the General Secretary of the CF40, Mr. Wang Haiming. The CF40 forum has conducted a research paper, a research program in the last year. That is a One Belt and Road Initiative program. I'm delighted to be joined the program. So my presentation is focused on the soft connection. What is soft connections? In contrast to the infrastructure connections, as you know, the BNR initiative has conducted a lot of infrastructure connections with along the countries, around more than 60 countries. Today I don't describe the many things about the infrastructure connections. I just focus on the soft connections. That means the rules and standards of for the investments and the finance in the BNR construction. So, as you know, China has entered a new phase of opening up, which is we want to shift from the trade, from the goods movements, the people movements, and then other productive factors movements to the one in which we would like to integrate international rules and standards with Chinese rules and standards and Chinese practice. So that is the real meaning of the soft connections. I'd like to make a briefing on the last 5 years achievements in the BNR construction. Over the last 5 years, we have 4 points. We have achieved the 4 points. The firstly is stable, smooth policy negotiations with other countries. Right now, we have 130 countries and international organizations support the BNR construction. And for the infrastructure connectivity, we have achieved a lot in the process in the past 5 years, including the high-speed rails and the pipelines and so on. And many countries we have done a lot of the infrastructure connectivity, which improves greatly the foundation of the infrastructure, and it is very helpful to promote the economic development in those countries and regions. The third one is green trade with delightful output. So in the past 5 years, we have developed a lot of trade between among those countries. According to statistics, accumulated amount of trade in goods and just in goods along the initiative countries exceeds $5 trillion US. $5 trillion US. And the third one is the stated ones in finance with outstanding effects. According to the figures, over the past 5 years, Chinese FDI, the foreign direct investments along the countries, along the initiative countries, exceeds $70 billion US. So it's a huge, is a great increase in this area. And I just point out some examples. So the AIIB and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, 34 projects has been enforced with a total amount of $7 billion US. And the Silk Road Fund, this is a Chinese fund to focus on the BNR initiative. They have 17 projects invested in the BNR initiative. And the commercial banks the signed issues. Signed issues is policy organizations to issue the investments and credit on the BNR initiative countries. With some of the characteristics of the BNR construction, the 4 points I'd like to make. For the over past 5 years, we call the financing and investment version, we just call 1.0 the version. This is a preliminary version. But right now we need to upgrade from the version 1 to the version 2. In the first 5 years of the initiative construction, we have some characteristics. One is this initiative was driven and guided by the policy-oriented finance in China. That means in China, the policy financial institutions take a leading role in those processes. And another characteristic is a leading role of state-owned enterprises. As you know, in China, state-owned enterprises has taken a leading role in this project. As well as in the meantime, many private enterprises follow up. Right now, you can see more and more enterprises that wants to go out for, in particular, go to the initiative countries to invest and finance. The third one is corporate and mass effect in blocks. So a lot of cooperative activities has taken place in this area. And initiation of cooperation investment and finance, for example, our National Development Bank, and then the import and export the banks and other commercial banks, they have a lot of cooperative activities with other international organizations such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the European and Construction Bank, and so on. And also, we are delighted to see the HSBC and other big foreign banks have joined us to have joined the operation of the initiative construction. Looking forward, we have found there's a huge demand in investment and finance in the BNR infrastructure. A lot of projections has been made. For example, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and for domestic many domestic institutions have started this case. So we just sum up. This is a conservative estimation for the demands. So our studying group calculated based on the weight of infrastructure in GDP at a certain development stage of a country. During 2018 to 2012 to 2022, just for this period, the total investment amount in infrastructure in countries along the BNR initiative will be 4.5 to 5.9 trillion US dollars. So this is just an average. For the World Bank and the other international organizations, their estimation is much bigger than the number. So it doesn't matter. So anyway, we sum up that looking forward, the demand of the investment and finance is huge. So there's a great gap, is a huge gap between the demands and supplies, of course. So the problem is for us is, of course, the BNR initiative was raised by China, but it belongs to the world. So, but right now we face the problem is we recognize that reliance on Chinese funds is not sustainable. That is obvious. The problem we face. So in the next stage, we should diversify the funding sources and share benefits and the risks. And that means that all parties to be joined in this program to share fees and then share interests and share risks. So that is the problem we face, and the next stage we want to push forward this direction in this direction. So this is a dilemma. In order to absorb all funding sources from the world or from the international organizations, so right now we just face in dilemma or trilemma. The one is, of course, if you want to absorb all financial resources to be involved in the BNR initiative, we should have standards and rules, and we should share same rules and standards. But right now, the international standards are plausible on the BNR initiatives. Later on, I will explain a little bit about that. And if we want to use Chinese rules and standards, it's also not plausible to the initiatives. And of course, another choice is to delay. We want to delay tactics. That means we just wait. We take a wait and see approaches. I think it is not a good choice for all of us, for all of us and BNR initiative countries. So that is that we have a dilemma in this area. So let me explain a little bit about the three of the dilemma, about subscribe the dilemma. For the international standards, do not fix all countries in the BNR initiative. For example, among 65 countries along the initiative, there are 8 listed developed countries, and according to the standards of the World Bank, and 16 non-WTO members. They don't apply to the standards of made by the WTO, and the 24 countries they are below the Human Development Index average by the United Nations. So that means among around the 65 countries in the BNR initiative, so there are many countries, most of them are underdeveloped countries and nations. So these countries are not in line with the high quality and the high standards of international international rules in investments and finance. But on the contrary to the standards, those initiative countries have strong demands for development, of course, and they also have a great market potential with low costs on the production factors, and they have demands, and they have a lot of resources to develop their economies. So that is their demands. And one thing right now, some people criticize that the BNR initiative has increased the data burden of the all initiative countries. So our studying group has calculated some numbers. So let me explain those numbers. According to the available figures from 63 countries from the BNR initiative, we just compare before the initiative, the BNR initiative, 5 years before and 5 years after. We just cover the 10-year figures to compare. That is conclude that before 5 years of the initiative, the 12 and after the initiative 5 years, just 12 out of the 63 countries are positive. That means that among the 63 countries, just 12 countries have increased their data burden. Of course, among them, there are 8 countries. The growth rate of the data burden has grown over 10%. Is quite a little bit higher than the other countries. But if we analyze the details of the data growth in 12 of these countries, they have different situations. So they're not on the increase of the data is not reliable on the BNR initiative construction. They have different reasons for the increase of the data burden. So we don't think the BNR initiative has increased the totally the burden level of those countries. Of course, for the international standards, they usually have some additional political conditions and demands on economic policy changes attached to those countries. So, for these reasons, the international standards are not completely plausible to the current situation of the BNR initiative countries. And the second one is for our Chinese domestic rules. We suggest it needs to amend. It needs to amend some rules. For example, some countries want the Chinese funds and technologies, but they are concerned about the over-reliance on China. And then another issue is requirement on the Chinese the mid and long-term criteria. We over focused on the Chinese content. That means Chinese ingredients. That means for example, some projects we require them to purchase the more Chinese goods and technologies. So that is some ratios, the limits for the projects. And in this way, of course, these loans should be financed by the Chinese government and the police financial institutions. So in this area, we need to amend some measures on this regard. And of course, right now in China, some domestic enterprises are enthusiasms about investing and financing in the projects in the BNR initiative countries, but sometimes they compete each other in pricing, for example. So that could be the generate some potential risks for the debt default, and of course it's not sustainable in this regard. Finally, in China, our some of the domestic rules we have insufficient transparency. Some documents not displaced. We have so in this regard, and also generate some doubts on the Chinese policies. So what is our views on enhancing soft connections? So in this briefing, we have raised 6 areas. The one is investment dispute solution mechanisms we need to build up, and of course we need to amend our domestic credit rules. And the third point is to enhance the risk evaluation and the warning systems. And then the late default solution mechanisms are very important in promotion in the investment and finance. And strengthen the anti-corruption and anti-bribery is a pressing issue for the construction. And finally, the transparency is important. What is the policy recommendations the study group has raised? So in this area, first we suggest that we need to amend some domestic credit rules. For example, maybe we could loosen Chinese content requirements. So we need to take the principle from the Chinese contents to the Chinese interests, the principle. So other countries has adopted such approaches. For example, the South Korea, Japan, and other countries has moved from the national contents to the national interests. Of course, national interest has extensive meaning of the categories. Of course, we need to improve our investment and finance models. For example, we need to reduce the government support the finance in the initiative countries. We need to further develop PPP models and BOT models. For example, adopt more costumes, co-insurance and reinsurance and activities and so on. And of course, we need to modify the guarantee policies. Right now, the Chinese import-export insurance companies, they just provide 100% of the risk guarantees to the financial institutions. So according to the international practice, they should let commercial banks and other financial institutions to remain part of risk in their own banks. We think that we should amend such rules and generations and terms of the insurance. And finally, we need to extend the terms of loans. Right now, for example, in China, we just regulated that the loan terms, the maximum term of the loan terms is just 15 years. Is too long. Comparing to the World Bank and other international organizations and other international commercial banks, they could provide a maximum of 40 years, the very long-term loans. So they can better match the terms of infrastructure and other and other facilities finance. Secondly, it is important that we need to improve the implementing of investment protection and dispute solution mechanisms. So in this stage, China needs to sign some agreements with some countries along the road, the bilateral agreements in the investment protection and the dispute solution mechanisms. But right now, some countries didn't sign off such an agreement, and some countries signed, but not enforced. We need to urge them to enforce the signed agreements between the two countries. And furthermore, we need to study and negotiate and reach multilateral trade and investment treaties, which is more important than the bilateral agreements. So in the next stage, we suggest that we need to develop multilateral trade and investment treaties along the initiatives. And of course, in China, we want to implement the legal structure of overseas investments. So we suggest that we need to formulate the overseas investment, the insurance law, or export credit insurance law in China. Right now, we don't have such a regulation in place. The third one is very complicated. That is the financial risk evaluation and the warning system. So, which is very important for us. So a lot of things to be done on this area. For example, we need to establish BNR project investment and finance promotion institution along the initiative. And we need to establish centralized country limit policy among Chinese financial institutions. Right now, all of the financial institutions, we don't have one country limit on the lending and the finance and the investment and finance. So we need to integrate all limits from the individual financial institutions to put one country limit. We need to have for one country, we just have a certain limit to control the financial risks. And of course, another way is construct joint insurance the mechanisms. We should consider to negotiate with other countries in the BNR initiative, along initiative. And for the warning evaluation mechanisms, a lot of things to be done. We suggest that we should have top-level design in the BNR country risk warning and evaluation mechanisms. So right now, many in China, a lot of institutions has conducted such a program. For example, some government agencies and some policy financial institutions and commercial banks, they have their own evaluation of risk on those countries. But we think we need to put a whole picture of the country and exchange views among them, and to evaluate effectively the financial risks in those countries. Of course. All time. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. And then the fourth one is the debt default payout program. Of course, is very important So this is one of the weaknesses in the construction of the BNR construction, because we don't have such a bilateral, multilateral debt default bailout programs. So in the future, we believe there's a more debt defaults to be emerged. So that is a pressing issue for all the countries to share the system, the bailout system. Strength on anti-corruption is very important, of course. And then finally, the openness and transparency in investment and finances is also important. So next step, we suggest that we should increase the transparency and the openness of our policies. And the other issues, including the labor and the social responsibilities, and then the tax and anti-tax and so on. So that's my briefing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, and special thanks to Adam Posen and Haiming Wang. It's always a pleasure to be back here at the Peterson Institute. What I'm going to talk today about is some work we're doing at the World Bank, and many of the working papers are already posted online. And Michela Ruta, who's here today with me, is leading the initiative along with several other economists at the bank, and about 30 have participated in some of this work. So it's a big project we're doing. And what's coming out of this work is, just in a nutshell, that the Belt and Road Initiative is a valuable initiative. What's really important are complementary reforms. I'm going to talk a little bit about that to make it work, including a faster move towards international standards, which we've just spoken about, as well as more transparency and data. So what do? We compile data and provide evidence. And I like very much what Adam said at the beginning about contributing to substantial discussion. That's exactly what we're trying to do with this project. So we're putting some data and evidence together, and the goal is focused on the recipient countries. So the countries that are participating, and how to help them maximize the benefits and minimize the risks, because there are some serious risks from any big infrastructure type of investment around the world. And the focus of our project is on connectivity and economics. So we're not going to talk about the political side of this, and we're not going to focus on energy except when we think about debt. So just to quickly remind everybody what the Belt and Road Initiative is, there are 6 corridors. For our study, we had to define the part we're going to look at, so we picked the countries that are lying along those 6 corridors. About a quarter of the projects we look at are in transport infrastructure, and as I said, that's what we're going to focus on. And these countries account for 40% of global trade. So this is a really big region, important for trade. That's why we want to focus on it. And there's a lot of missing trade from a gravity model in the region, as well as missing foreign investment. So first, I'm just going to really quickly set the stage of what trade and trade policy and infrastructure looks like in the region, for why you might want to think about this initiative. There are big infrastructure gaps. So if you look at the countries, especially many of those around China, you see that measured vis-a-vis our logistics performance indicator, they don't perform that well. So it's a way of looking at the quality of transport infrastructure, and on average, they're below the global average within the region. But there's also this huge diversity where some are really bad performers and some are good performers. And, you know, I want to think a minute about why you'd want to coordinate infrastructure. Because if for any individual country, there's an incentive to build infrastructure, but some of that infrastructure is valuable to countries outside that might have to pass through. But any country wouldn't internalize that benefit. There's also a benefit from coordinating infrastructure to ensure it connects. So it's good to have a coordinated plan. After all, the EU does this as well with their trans-European transport networks. So they have the same kind of idea about coordinating infrastructure. In addition to infrastructure gaps, there are some policy gaps. So countries in the BRI tend to have high tariffs, and they also have long waits at the border. And this is going to be really important when we looked at the effect of this initiative, because you can improve the road, but if you're stuck at the border for a day, that improvement in the road is going to be worth a lot less. So let's think about the effects of this transport infrastructure. We know there's a need, there's an infrastructure gap. What are the effects of building this infrastructure? So this is where our data and analysis comes in. So what the authors did is they looked at newspaper articles, government documents, and then also confirmed with our regional offices around the world to try and identify the big infrastructure projects in these countries that have at some point been described as BRI projects. And these are the projects, so you can see we have rail improvement, road improvement, new roads, new rail, as well as seaports. So we're going to be looking both at maritime and at transport, and then say, okay, using geographical information systems technology, which can tell you how long it takes to get from one point to another, just like when you're driving somewhere with your GPS, we look at what that looks like before this infrastructure is built, then we impose this infrastructure on it, assuming average times of a high-speed rail or of a new rail or of a new road of the type that's being built, and say, how do those times change? And that's how we can describe the effect this is going to have on trade, on investment, and so forth. So, what we find is that times in the Belt and Road economies are along these Belt and Road corridors are reduced by 12% on average. Some are significantly more than that, some are a little bit less. But there's also effects for the world, because if you're exporting from the US to Pakistan, you also benefit from the new infrastructure in Pakistan as well. So there's effects to the rest of the world of a 3% reduction in trade costs. One other thing we did is so this is looking at the infrastructure as a coordinated effort. But we can also look at each individual piece of infrastructure and say, what's the value of that, thinking about how a gravity model would weigh it. And then there are ways of using those estimates on trade and thinking about what would happen to land values. And this is a way of looking at the value of an individual piece. We do find, using that method, that about 32 out of 68 of the ones for which there's enough information to do this are unviable individually. So this gets to one of the concerns about stranded assets, that if you don't build the whole network or you don't analyze the infrastructure carefully, you can end up with some unviable options. So that's one of the risks. But what are the effects on income and poverty? So when we do the analysis using a CGE model, what we find is that improved integration could increase real incomes by 7%, and in BRI economies over a percentage point. and then using a structural model which takes into account global value chains, the gains are even larger. So there are big gains. And just to put this in context, when people have looked at using a CGE model, what would happen if the world went to global free trade, the gain is about 1% of real income. So this is a big gain we're talking about that would come to the region and even to the world from building this infrastructure. So what are the complementary policies that we would need along the way? One is, as we saw at the beginning, there are high costs of crossing borders in this region. If we reduce those costs as well, so if the weights at the border and so forth declined, are reduced by half, then we can see how much additional impact we would get from this initiative. And I think what's important to note is that if tariffs and border delays are reduced, the bang is about doubled. So it's really important in this initiative not just to focus on infrastructure, but also to focus on policies at the border, tariffs, and so forth. The second point of complementary policies that's standard with any type of trade liberalization, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it here, is that there's going to be adjustment costs. So there's going to be winners and losers from this effort. And so what we did here is look at the spatial inequalities that would develop, and I'm just focusing on Kazakhstan, that what tends to happen is where the infrastructure is built, and typically, especially in urban areas, you get a really big boost. But some of the areas further away from the infrastructure might end up being worse off as a result of economic activity moving to these new centers. And so it's really important to have adjustment policies and labor mobility especially, so that people can move to the thriving areas. But in some countries there are real issues around labor mobility that again might make the initiative not as powerful as it otherwise could be. So let me talk a bit about the risks, and since this session is on financing, I'm going to focus on fiscal, but I am going to mention some of the other risks that we've analyzed as well. So when you look at debt in the BRI countries, there's been a big discussion increasingly as we've seen we've seen rising debt levels, particularly in low income and some emerging market countries. There's a concern around debt and in relation to this large infrastructure initiative at this time. I want to make really 2 points here. The first is that if you look at low-income developing countries overall, the non-Paris Club, which is largely China, is not a large share. So it's about 10 to 15% of the total debt of the countries in that group. But where we do see an effect of the Belt and Road Initiative is on the low-income developing countries that are in high risk of debt distress. And there's both a large share of debt from non-Paris Club, and it's also been increasing over time. So this is where one might be concerned. I'm going to show you some data on which countries are in greater risk of debt distress and how the Belt and Road might be contributing to that. And again, for this part, we're considering both the full Belt and Road Initiative, including the data we have on energy investments as well. So what these two graphs show for the two different groups of countries is their current debt to GDP levels on the vertical axis, and then the expected BRI debt financing as a percent of GDP on the horizontal axis, using the projects that we have. And from those projects, on some of them, we have more information on terms and conditions, and it leads us to the assumption that about 80% of the projects are debt financed. And this is an assumption. We'd like to have more data, but using that assumption, what you can see is that for some countries, the BRI is leading to, could lead, if everything is implemented, to debt. It could contribute to debt problems. And one thing to take into account is this doesn't consider growth that would come from that initiative, because it's just looking at relative to current GDP. We know that infrastructure promotes growth. So if you take that into account, this wouldn't be quite as concerning, but what we do see is that the growth required to stabilize the debt ratio for some of these countries is much higher than their historical growth rates. So even if this contributes somewhat to growth, there still is a concern for a handful of countries about the fiscal risks developing from the Belt and Road Initiative. So then we have some policy recommendations considering how you would think about managing these fiscal risks. And one thing is very important to have more transparency on the terms and conditions of BRI projects so that we can do debt analyses more carefully. China has yet to engage in a cooperative framework, which could make any kind of restructuring much more difficult and complex. And then for the recipient countries, they really need to assess what these projects mean before they take the financing. And so there are some things they need to think about is having a comprehensive fiscal framework, thinking about collateralized borrowing and what that would mean in the event of debt distress, and improved regulatory frameworks. And let me just go quickly through the rest. I know we're a bit stressed for time. We also look at governance risks, and the paper on public procurement is already on the World Bank website. And one thing, you know, there's 2 points why this is really important. One is simply just efficiency. You want the best possible builder to build your infrastructure for the amount of money that you're going to spend on it. So it's better to have open bidding, less likely to lead to corruption. And two, in writing these contracts, you also want to think about the employment benefit, training for maintenance of that equipment, and ensure that some of that is going to the local population. Corruption relating to public procurement, of course, again, the open bidding will help, but we also think of other ways, feedback mechanisms and things like that, that can help to reduce corruption. We spend a lot of time worrying about environmental costs of these projects. And 2 points here. The first is people often think about the direct environmental risks. So when you build it, especially in these yellow areas, which are biodiversity hotspots, there can be immediate problems with pollution or alteration of habitats and so forth. And you'd want to have safeguards around that. But actually, the bigger issue with building this large coordinated project is it changes economic activity. It moves economic activity around. And that's where actually the bigger environmental impacts come from. I mean, more production is more risks to the environment, and especially when it moves to certain places. But you can also have positive effects if, because of the way production moves, you actually end up producing in a location that's less environmentally damaging. So there are both positive and negative indirect effects that one would want to take into account that can really be done through careful analysis, especially if it can be done at the corridor level. So I'll just conclude here that there are big gains from this initiative, but realizing them to their full extent will require these complementary policies. It will also require managing these substantial risks. And finally, very important to have more transparency, more data, and again, this more substantial kind of discussion around this initiative. And the only way we're going to have that is really if we know what it looks like, because it's very hard to talk about something if you don't have the data. And towards that effort, we've posted all of our papers online and blogs here. The one on the environment should be coming very shortly. We have papers on trade. We have papers on government procurement, and the debt paper should be coming shortly as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, both Gang and Caroline. That was fantastic. I am unilaterally, transparently, in good governance extending the session by 10 to 12 minutes so we can have discussion. I am standing to the side so I do not pretend to comment on things where we have genuine experts ahead of me. Just to reinforce one last point Caroline made, the work that her group and her colleagues at the World Bank is doing is terrific. The work that Xiaogang has put forward is very far-sighted. Their presentations will be available on the PIIE website and links to their background at their home institutions as well, including CF40. So let me open this up to our floor. Just a couple reminders. This is on the record. We are webcasting live, and the video will be posted again to the website and perhaps to CF40 website. You are welcome, anybody here is welcome to pose a question. There's a moving mic up front with Jessica. There's a standing mic at back. Please identify yourself. The shorter your intervention, the less it can be a question. The longer your intervention, it has to be a question. So stay brief. Who would like to go first? Okay, maybe we'll take long interventions. Anybody? Please. Oh, sorry, people should identify where they're from.
Jeremy, Goldman Sachs. Just a question for Mr. Gang. What you presented was interesting, but almost felt like the reinventing the wheel. All of the aims that you suggested already exist. It's called the World Bank. So if the aim of One Belt, One Road is not political and geopolitical control, why not do what the Japanese did in the 90s, make a big contribution to the World Bank, get your own vice presidency, and influence where that money goes, but done in a proper way?
Could you hit the on button on the mic? Thank you.
Thank you. That is the direction we need to do to have a cooperative system in job.
That's better.
Sorry,
could you repeat?
That could be a direction we need to do to enjoy, to absorb a lot of international financial resources to join the joint program. So it's no problem. But of course, as you know, the initiative was raised by China firstly in just the first 5 years. So at this period, it's understandable that China has increased more money on those projects. This is natural, is it? And in the future, we need to. Yeah, our principle of the BRI is the common construction, the share benefits and the share risks. So this is the general principle for the project.
Thank you. There, please.
So it's a question for Carolyn Freund.
Could you please identify yourself?
So I'm Bob Donor. I'm at the Atlantic Council. It's a question for Carolyn Front. I was struck in your presentation that the estimated reduction in transport times was only 12%. Was that because it's a measure of where stuff goes now and only part of it is covered by the Belt and Road, as opposed to what the Belt and Road projects would do to transport times along their paths?
So that's the average reduction within the countries along the Belt and Road. So if you are along the corridors, for some particular countries, the reductions are much longer. If a whole corridor is being revamped, it could be, 25% or something like that. Then the point is that's only the infrastructure part. So if you also do the border delays, you can again get much bigger reductions. So that's the average along the full corridor. Yeah, so this is taking into account getting from one location to another location.
Thank you. Next.
I'm Roy McFarker from Google. I wanted to ask a question to Xiaogang. You mentioned on one of your slides, just in passing, that a goal of the Belt and Road Initiative was the adoption of Chinese technical standards. And I was wondering whether you could say a little more about that.
You had mentioned as your presentation one goal of BRI was getting wider adoption of Chinese technical standards.
I mean the Chinese, for Chinese side, we need to give up the tactics of delaying, of making decisions on this. So for our studying group suggestion is that we need to we need to speed up the integration of the international standards and the domestic standards. So we don't delay to make decisions on this area. So that is what I want to say in this paper.
Thank you. The back mic.
Yes, thanks, Adam. I'm Randy Henning at American University. One of the stated objectives of the Belt and Road Initiative has been to increase the international role of the renminbi. So I wanted to ask the two of you, to what extent is that actually the case? We don't have complete information about the contracts under the Belt and Road Initiative, but from the few contracts that I have seen, it appears as if several of these are denominated in US dollars.
Right now, the finance and investments account for in US dollars account for majority of the finance in the BIR. So in the process, we want to increase the use of RMB in the constructions, but several factors to dampen the process. One is, as you know, in the previous years, the depreciation of RMB has reduced the amount of international RMB use in the international activities. So right now, you know, comparing to 3 years ago, the RMB use in international stage has been reduced from 5th places to the right now the eighth places. So it's dropping. It's dropping. Of course, in China, we have a contraction between the domestic policy goals and external or international RMB use. For example, right now we need to maintain the stable of the RMB foreign exchange rate. So in this way, we want to share the independent and monetary policies as well. At the same time, we need some capital controls on some areas. So in this regard, the internationalization of RMB, the process of internationalization of RMB has been slowed down in recent years. So of course, this is our ambition to increase the international use of RMB in the next stage. So we suggest that in the construction of the PIIE, we need to use more RMB on the finance of projects.
Thank you. At the back mic, then there, and then also at the back mic, if you could, please.
Hi, I'm Annabelle Gonzalez here at the Peterson Institute. I remember reading that there have been 2 international courts that have been established in China, I believe in Shenzhen and in Xi'an, to deal with disputes under the Belt and Road Initiative. Gang, can you please comment on this? Thank you.
Sorry, it was mentioning that there were international courts that were established in China specifically for adjudicating matters having to do with the Belt Road Initiative. Yeah. Do you have any knowledge of this? Would you like to comment on it?
This I think, is a long process to be integrated in Chinese domestic into the international courts. So it should be step by step, but this is the direction we need to do.
Okay. There, please.
Hi, Heidi Kribo-Redeker, International Capital Strategies in the Council on Foreign Relations. You had a slide about the development of a debt default bailout mechanism, and on that slide you said that China should join the Paris Club with conditions. Could you comment on what those conditions should be?
And also, Caroline, if you feel comfortable, you should comment as well. If you don't, don't. Please, Xiao.
Yeah. You could say. Go ahead. Yeah.
Could you expand a bit on China joining the Paris Club and what conditions? You mentioned the possibility of conditions. What conditions do you have in mind?
As you know, it's an open question. It's an open question. We can discuss the issue as she mentioned earlier in her paper. Right now, in the previous years, the Paris Club, the Chinese state in Paris Club is quite low. But right now, with the development of the overseas investment from China to the PIIE, the increase, so the China's way is increasing in the Paris Club. But of course, it's a double-edged sword for our country. So we need to evaluate the situation, the terms of the Paris clubs, and this is a complicated issues for us, for the starting group from the CF40 forum, and we think on one hand the Paris Club needs to adapt to the new environment of the world. So they need change to some rules and regulations according to the new situations took place in the current stage, among the countries. On the other hand, China needs to create conditions to be joined in the Paris Club clause. So this is open question for discussion.
Thank you.
Maybe just to add, we had discussions around this recently in China, and I think different institutions have different views. But to add some levity, one of the views we heard was that the Paris Club, even in the name, is a rich country club, and so they weren't ready to join. So maybe if it wasn't called Paris.
All right, let's call it the French Concession Club. Concession's a good word in debt things, anyway. Last question, please.
Fred Bergston from the Peterson Institute. Question for Xiao Gang. I thought one of the most important parts of your presentation was your effort to integrate Chinese rules and international rules to govern the Belt and Road projects. And you had a slide that pointed to those ideas. You argued that the international rules were not plausible. And to be honest, I was not persuaded by your presentation. And I wondered if you could go back to that slide or elaborate for us on why you think the international rules are not plausible and not applicable to the projects and arrangements that you're working out under Belt and Road.
It's a nature. China is an emerging economy and is the largest developing countries. So we need to reform our systems, our economies, and our regulations. So it's obvious. We recognize, we admitted that there's a lot of weaknesses in our financial system, in our financial regulations. So that is in China, that is obvious. So we need to integrate our domestic regulations into international standards. Of course, that is our basic view and the basic points for us. So China has a long way to go. A lot of things to be done in Chinese financial industry. So we deeply acknowledge that we need to do a lot to further reform our systems, financial systems.
Okay, a lot to discuss. Thank you all for engaging. Thank you particularly to Xiaogong and Carolyn Freund for giving us a tour through some really deep and detailed thinking on Belt Road. We are not going to take a break. Obviously, those of you here can take one quietly. Those of you online, keep it on. We're shifting to our second discussion on U.S.-China bilateral issues and reform of the WTO. Haiming Wang will chair.
Okay, in the following session, we will discuss China-U.S. bilateral issues and the reform of multilateral trading system. We are honored to have three experts. Firstly, PIIE Senior Fellow, Chad Bloom. The second speaker is CF40 Academic Advisor, Professor Lu Feng. The third is Professor Jeffrey Scott, PIIE Senior Fellow. So please chat.
This is a fun new game we can play called Chase the PowerPoint. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to participate in this today. What I thought I would do in just a couple of minutes is to walk through how to think about the conflicts that are taking place right now between China and the United States, but I think China and the trading system more broadly, how that fits into the broader WTO context, and to think potentially through paths out of this. See if I can go forward. Okay, so first slide, this is not news to anybody, but this is just to make sure we're all on the same page as to essentially what's happened so far. So just to recap the events of 2018, it's essentially tariffs, right? So the argument that I will make here is if you look beneath the hood in terms of what the Trump administration in particular did on tariffs last year, whether we're talking about solar panels, steel, aluminum, or the Section 301 tariffs on China, it really is, at some level, some systemic concern with China that's behind all of it, right? Whether it's the intellectual property and the forced technology transfer issues of the Section 301 report. It's the industrial subsidies, the state-owned enterprises of steel and aluminum, also solar panels as well in the very first Section 201 case. So now we're at this stage where we've got basically 12% of U.S. imports from the world now sitting under new tariffs. We've got ongoing processes in place to think about changing up or changing up the U.S. system for foreign investment, for national security reasons, new rules and regulations on export controls. These events are taking place not only here, but elsewhere around the world as well. Okay, so we're now at a moment where, you know, this crisis has emerged, perhaps a point of leverage has emerged, but it's clearly an inflection point in the global trading and investment system. Obviously, in the trading partner response to the tariffs has been retaliation and lots of tariffs of their own. But most of the tariffs in retaliation to the United States have actually come from China. So now 8% of U.S. exports are sitting under foreign tariffs, but 7 percentage points of that are actually China. Okay. At the same time, you do have actually things happening in Geneva through the formal dispute settlement channels. Now, as I say this, you're going to say to me, Chad, but there's this crisis, WTO dispute settlement, the holdup of appellate body members, dispute settlement may not be there in a year. I agree. I'm not punting. Actually, I am punting on all of those issues. Jeff, I think, is going to cover those in his talk. So what I want you to do is to kind of suspend disbelief for a moment and imagine this dispute settlement system that's functioning. And partially that's because you have to. There are disputes that are there that are ongoing, and there are disputes that are continuing to be filed even by the United States. And if for no other reason these disputes signal fundamental areas of systemic concern that have to be grappled with, that have to be dealt with, even if they're going to be dealt with not ideally through litigation and legal rulings from panel members in the WTO appellate body, but potentially new rules to clarify areas of disagreement between countries. These are flashpoints of concern. So what are they? Well, in the last year, you know, since essentially the Section 301 report was filed, there have been a couple of disputes filed against China on the issues that are brought up in the report, right? So the United States and Europe brought up one in Geneva on the Chinese licensing laws, essentially. But the Europeans, initially over the summer, but then they followed up on this just in December, have filed a second and I would argue more substantive dispute, putting forth arguments that they say, you know, we can actually litigate this stuff in Geneva. There are WTO rules, there are WTO provisions on electric vehicles, or the Chinese rules and failures to allow for adequate joint ventures and forced technology transfer in the areas of electric vehicles, you know, biotech, seeds, things like that. So there are disputes that are being brought forward on these issues. There's, of course, old disputes that have never really fully been resolved, including on China's market economy status, whether or not what the United States has done over the last few years under its countervailing duty law in treating implicit subsidies to state-owned enterprises, or that state-owned enterprises might be granting even to private firms under you know, the American definition of what a public body would be. None of these have really been resolved, at least formally from the United States perspective. So there's disputes about adequate access in the West, the United States and Europe, to trade remedies, being able to use anti-dumping, countervailing duties to be able to address the concerns of the Chinese economy not fully transitioning to being market-oriented. And then, of course, there's lots of other non-disputes that I have up there in the last category, things that could have been litigated in the WTO that aren't, including a lot of the issues in the Section 301 report, at least not being brought forward by the United States, though this new case by Europe is arguing that there are WTO rules and Chinese commitments that could be litigated there. And then some on industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. At the very tail end of the Obama administration, there was this dispute filed over primary aluminum subsidies that really hasn't been taken up by the Trump administration. Okay, so what is it that's actually happening behind the scenes? So there are these disputes, but there is this big question out there: is what's actually going to be a functioning dispute settlement system? Fine. But behind the scenes, there is this trilateral process. And let me describe a little bit about how this thing might play out and what potential role this might play here. So in December of 2017, in Buenos Aires at the WTO Ministerial, you had this joint statement issued by U.S. Trade Representative and trade ministers from the European Commission and Japan, laying out a potential path forward and issues that they want to address. They have followed this up with 4 meetings and joint statements issued since then over the last year. And so this is clearly something that they are working on and developing. Now, what is it that they're trying to develop? It's essentially the following. It's new rules on these essential concerns that not only the United States, but Japan and the European Union as well have identified primarily with China on industrial subsidies and SOEs. Foreign investment, technology transfer, the issues of lack of notifications and transparency on subsidies in the WTO. In this context, that's what they mean when they refer to as WTO reform types of issues. And then finally, more proactively perhaps, rules on digital trade and e-commerce. Now, how is it that that this process might actually work? Well, this we don't know, right? Most of this at the moment is taking place behind the scenes, except these issuance of joint statements when they meet every quarter or so. But potentially, one could imagine what emerging is first an agreement amongst these three about how they see a path forward on new rules, right? This is not going to be trivial in and amongst themselves, come to an agreement on what this might mean. The second step would be that, that they would then present what they themselves agree to other like-minded countries, perhaps, and we've seen some of this happening already. But then the question would be, well, what happens after that, right? So you have a handful of countries that ultimately agree amongst themselves what new rules might look like. How do you turn that into, a set of new deals, and what is the place for this within the WTO, system? So far what we've seen in terms of deliverables, the transparency proposal, right, this is probably the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit, was actually tabled at the WTO and the Good Council in November. This latest iteration here, the meetings in Washington in January, indicated that when it comes to rules for industrial subsidies, they might make text public sometime this spring. That's what they're working toward at the moment. The other areas, though, seem less far along. So to conclude, I think I just want us to look at, even if we sort of believe that this might be a path forward to resolving these issues between not only the United States, but arguably the United States and to a lesser degree Europe and Japan with China, there's a lot of big questions that are out there. The first is, when we think about even the most straightforward potentially drafting of new rules on industrial subsidies in state-owned enterprises, where we have texts from the TPP agreement, CPTPP, the other trade deals that the Europeans and Japanese have signed, what are we talking about here? Are there going to be incentives and carrots to encourage and facilitate Chinese reform, or is this just, expanding the toolbox of the United States and Europe to have more expansive use of trade remedies, essentially, allowing them to be able to use anti-dumping, countervailing duties? And is that the kind of deal that we're talking about? Bigger questions, coming to any sort of agreement, how would these things ultimately be enforced? Right? I already talked a little bit about this crisis in Geneva in terms of WTO dispute settlement. It's under threat. But I think the historical argument has been that it's been an insufficient system to hold China's feet to the fire in terms of its WTO commitments. So if the old system didn't work, which was seemingly going to be more biting than what we would have without an appellate body, what it's going to replace it. And then finally, even if you could agree amongst yourselves to all of these things, these three major economies, how do you get China to agree to these things as well, right? China's not actively involved in these negotiations yet. Would they be put together in terms of one big package? And what's in it for China to be able to make it a win-win, right? Trade agreements, there has to be something in there for everybody to be politically viable, to be economically sustainable. What is that going to look like? And what's the path toward ultimately getting there? And then just the last one would be what happens to all those tariffs? With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be back to Peterson Institute to discuss this WTO reform issue. And the previous speaker has given us sort of the outline already, So last year, the G20 summit communique has endorsed WTO reform agenda. That means that the sort of international consensus over the agenda of the WTO reform has been, established already. So I would like to give sort of the sketch overview on this process, mainly focused on the U.S. and China and disputes or relationships. I would like to briefly touch three issues. The number one is the background for this unfolding reform, new emerging WTO reform. Number two is the major events of last year also, leading to the current situation. What's the proposal out there already? What's the basic position taken by states, the developed countries, as well as by China or other countries? And then finally, I would like to give some comments on the possible challenge, issues for both states and China. Okay, so of course, my presentation will be to some extent overlap with colleague, okay, just given just now on the same topic, but I would be more elaborate on several issues I mentioned just now, we will have not been covered by Dr. Chat just now, okay. The background is, I think there's three forces, behind the new round of the WTO reform. Number one, I think it's rapid evolution of the global economic environments has increasing imposing pressures on the existing WTO rules. That is sort of the consensus across different countries. Number two, I think, Number two, I think it is in order to further promote globalization, we need to reform WTO rule. Number three, most important direct forces is Trump administration in this country changed their policy towards, a trade policy as well as the policy towards the WTO to make the necessary reform in WTO even more imperative. Okay, not be able to avoid further. Okay. So then there's a lot of things happened if you, and observe and document all the process. I don't have the time, and to go step by step in detail. You have this handout already. I'll only pick up several major documents, which may be, in my personal observation, regarded as milestone events in, the whole process leading to the current situation. So very important events is the Bilateral, and commercial trade ministries communique, mentioned by Dr. Chat. Actually, most important one I think is the Paris communique. Sorry. I think the Paris communique, they laid out major concerns by these three major developed countries. A lot of concerns, to my observation, personal observation, has been focused on the China-US disputes. A lot of the requests, these all four requests, highlighted in the 301 report, initiated in this country last March, all reflected in here. Even, and there's annex documents outline this concept, so-called market-oriented industry, criterions. I think that is something very important, reflected, the strategic thinking by the developed countries towards future, the trade governance, the trade rule, and the sort of the new generation of the trade rule. Of course, have a lot of implications for the unfolding WTO reform. Then on July, and when the EU leader, Juncker, visited DC, then there's a joint statement that they decided to kick off WTO reform. Then there's a EU proposal. The first proposal outline conceptually what they want to do in WTO reform. Okay. Then you can see the first part of this document outlines major concerns, reflected the key issues highlighted in the Paris communique, joint statement, as well as, and the requests or focus of the 301, Section 301 report, by USTR in this country. Then there's other issues, dispute settlement, monitoring, I think also, to me, it's also highlight relevant, to mirror, reflected in a mirror way of the China-US sort of dispute. Then there's another proposal put forward by Canada, also in September. I think this proposal is much more balanced, more comprehensive, not only reflected the request and appeal by United States and other major developed countries, but also concerns, shared by a lot of developing countries, even including China. Okay, then you can see, of course, they also, covered requests, by the proposal put forward by EU. Okay, I don't want to go to detail. You can see that, even if you're interested, you can see the concrete document. Okay, concrete document. Then, the first proposal to me, maybe I'm not correct, okay, put forward by 5 countries, including states, mainly focused on concrete measures to make sure that all these rules regarding notification, transparency, become enforceable, okay, become effective. That is also priority concern, on the side of developed countries, including US, okay, US. Then I think a very important development is sort of the plurilateral movements, occurred by these 12+1 countries held a first, to me, is a first real discussion, the conference and meeting in Ottawa, in October. Okay, without US, very interesting, without US, without China. Okay, so they put forward certain sort of the requests and opinions, reflected these kind of reflected the first, I think, written sort of intention, how to reform WTO, or how to reform WTO. So Canada play a very active role in this area. Then I think very important, Chinese position. China, in as early as July, and China indicated supporting policy stance towards a general concept of WTO reform. Then China issued the official documents cover 3+5 points of the policy position towards new WTO. Then you can see China emphasized we should preserve the core value of the multilateral trading system, safeguard development interests of developing members, should follow practice of decision-making by consensus. Then there's 5 opinions, more concrete, reflect China's concern or priority areas for WTO reform, like address the existing crisis of the problem faced by WTO, especially, the boycott action persistently taken by this country vis-a-vis in the context of the appointment of the member of the Appellate body, which serves as a core institution arrangements for the DSU, for WTO. I think that systematically reflects the position adopted by China at the current stage. Okay, so final issue now. Then China, very interestingly, China has actively made 2 proposals already, together with EU and India and other countries, okay, to put forward concrete suggestions what we should do in the coming up WTO reform. Many focused on, the issue I just mentioned, the current crisis of WTO, the TSU mechanism. Okay. So finally, I would like to say, if the WTO reform will, go smoothly this year and in future, I think both states and China will face some adjustment, will face some difficulty issues. For example, for states, I can see in these areas, okay, United States need to respond to, how can I say, difficult issues. Number one, TSU reform. Complaints from many members regarding boycott actions taken by, United States government with regard to appointment of the arbitrator of the Appellate body. Number two, many developing countries will defend their rights to have the special and the differential treatment in the multilateral rules. That is at odds with the official position by the United States. Number three, I think more importantly to my personal observation, that is that, just now in the previous session, some audience friends raised the issue in terms of the relationships between domestic policy in China versus multilateral rules. But here, we also have the similar problems. The relationships between domestic trade laws in this country, such as 301, versus, multilateral trading rules in future. Now, it's a common understanding, but the very fact of United States taking 301 as a policy instrument against China indicates, United States still want to take unilateral rules. But now, United States take initiative to reform WTO rule. So then I think it's legitimate for other countries will raise this question in the coming up WTO negotiation. Then finally, how to respond to wide concerns of U.S. has, not respected sufficiently these WTO rules. But of course, there's a lot of problems for China as well. For China, I think a lot of the requests by other members of the WTO may be categorized into two sort of groups of issues. Number one issue is so-called vertical issues on policy adjustments in relatively independent area or sectors, such as the further reduction of tariff for goods trade, further opening up surface trade, foreign investment, market access, or strengthening IPR protection, forced technology transfer, all these issues, all these concerns highlighted by states or other countries, labor standard, environmental protection, digital trade, or China highlighted as e-commerce issues. But second group, even more fundamental, even more challenging for China. These may be called horizontal issues across different sectors, different areas. Okay, some of them may touch one way or another the core institutional arrangements of the economic system in China. Okay, like the competitive neutrality on SOE, industrial policy, like the strengthening the rules of the regulating the subsidy issues, even transparency issues. All these issues are also, and very challenging for China. How China respond to these issues will be very important, not only to China's domestic reform, but also to the future, multilateral rules. So in summary, given the existing consensus among international community on the topic of WTO reform, given, what we briefly outlined, just now, the major proposals, major concerns or requests put forward by different countries or different country groups on this issue. So it's fairly, clear to me, in the coming months or years, I think this bilateral disputes between China and the US, a lot of issues in this context, in future, is likely to be facilitated by a way so-called in Chinese world working on two legs: bilateral talks, paralleled by the multilateral talks, facilitated by the WTO reform. Okay. So in this regard, I think this kind of the talk will provide more opportunities, new opportunities for China to reconsider, reform agenda domestically, but also provide new opportunities to create sort of the new multilateral trading rules, which will be very important for future global economic economy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. You have just heard two excellent presentations by Chad Bown and Dr. Liu. I'll try to avoid overlap and focus on the WTO dimension of the bilateral disputes between the United States and China. Now, the problem that we face today, and we are going to continue to face, is that the current WTO crisis limits the channel for resolving bilateral disputes, and therefore there's going to be more pressure for bilateral action. We've used the WTO often in the past, 23 cases by the United States, 15 by China, but the WTO system is breaking down for two reasons. Negotiations have failed to update the WTO rulebook, and as Chad mentioned, some WTO rules are applicable to current disputes between the United States and China, but the many areas of dispute are in the gray areas of WTO law or in areas where the WTO has not yet addressed the issues, and negotiations failed in the Doha round. Negotiations also failed on updating the WTO dispute settlement system. Talks actually began about the same time as the Doha round and had similar results. And so this has led countries to look to act unilaterally, and that is the cause of a lot of problems because it just compounds the WTO issues by adding extra legal or WTO incompatible actions to the ones that are under dispute. As a result, the United States has blocked appellate body, the approval of new appellate body members to try to force progress in the negotiations. There are already too few members to hear appeals of U.S.-China disputes. So the crisis isn't down the road, it already exists. And without recourse to appeals, panel rulings cannot be finalized, and remedial actions cannot be authorized by the WTO. Therefore, there is an inability of the multilateral process to enforce the rules that have been established in the WTO. And if you can't enforce the current rules, countries are not going to be willing to move forward aggressively to negotiate new rules. And you've seen that in the two presentations we've had so far. There hasn't been much progress at all on the substance, and even among like-minded WTO members like the United States and the European Union, much more on the transparency notification provisions where there is a broader acceptance. And therefore, we can likely see a continuation of resort to unilateral measures. Now, I've just included some data that I won't describe in great detail. The United States is by far the top user of WTO dispute settlement, and so should have an interest in an effective multilateral system. China's on the list, far below it, but in the top 10. U.S. cases challenge many countries. Chinese cases largely target the United States. 75% of Chinese cases brought to the WTO are against the United States. and half the cases brought against China have been by the United States. So the United States has the guts to bring legal action against China. Many countries don't. Interestingly, and I just put this up to give Chad a shout out, the Obama administration was the most active in filing cases against China. Now, the U.S. threatens to disable the dispute settlement process, as I said, as a means of pushing the negotiations. The U.S. concerns are twofold: procedures for conducting appeals of WTO rulings, and the issue of judicial overreach, rulings that broaden or allegedly broaden the scope of WTO obligations. The procedural issues are actually relatively easy to resolve. And they involve having more appellate body members, new rules for members to ensure objective and timely decisions. These are things that are under discussion, largely put forward in the EU-China proposal, but not being considered by the United States because of the lack of attention to the much more important but much more intractable problem of judicial overreach. That problem requires more fundamental reform that countries have not been willing to consider. It requires amendment of the WTO process. It actually requires a remand authority from dispute panels, an appellate body, to defer decisions, not take decisions, not issue interpretations where the rules are ambiguous, but to send the issue back to WTO committees or WTO members to further discuss and possibly negotiate clarifications and new rules. This is closer to the original concept of the WTO when it was developed and negotiated in the Uruguay round, that the WTO would be a forum for continuing negotiations. It hasn't been that. Now, what is China doing? We actually just got a much more detailed explanation, but the key points are that China is interested in maintaining the multilateral system and should be in favor of some of the proposals that were put forward for both the procedural and the judicial overreach issues. But China took little action in the now dormant WTO negotiations on dispute settlement reforms. So it's coming late to the party, but better late than never. And the EU-China proposal on mostly procedural issues is a good step forward to start the process of negotiations, but it needs to be supplemented. Interestingly, the proposal is comparable to what the US, EU, and Japan are doing, the trilateral initiative, on the rulemaking side. Here, those three countries are trying to develop templates for rules that could be broadened to other countries. But of course, that's not going to work unless you get all the major trading countries to sign on. And excluding China from the process has not been helpful. Having China not putting forward new ideas for either domestic economic reform or multilateral in the multilateral process indicates that the U.S. concerns are somewhat well-paced, that China would drag its feet in developing new rulemaking. But now China comes forward trying to do the exact same thing on the dispute settlement process. If China and the EU would deepen their reforms, broaden their reforms to cover the judicial overreach concerns of the United States and others, there might be a way of bringing the two processes together because, as both colleagues have said before, what is really needed is a progress on the negotiating front and progress on the dispute settlement front. The two go hand in glove. We're not seeing either go forward very quickly, though there are these initial inklings, but too slow to really deal with the much more urgent political problems that we face in our bilateral relations. So to succeed, WTO initiatives require the United States and China to work together. It means the U.S. needs to reinforce the dispute settlement process, not keep it at arm's length. And China needs to help develop effective disciplines, particularly on on support for state-owned enterprises. I think that is a key issue that underpins a lot of the concerns by the U.S. government. The alternative is to return the Gatt era practice of big power blocking of dispute settlement decisions, and therefore no effective enforcement if the defending country doesn't like it. And that would lead to continued use of extra-legal trade measures. That's likely to happen if we don't move quickly, and because there's one case where the United States is clearly focused, and that is the use of is the non-market economy status for China as defined under U.S. unfair trade statutes. This has led the United States in the revised NAFTA agreement to essentially target China by insisting on a provision in the revised NAFTA agreement that seeks to deter partner countries from negotiating free trade agreements with China and other non-market economies. And this isn't just bilateral free trade agreements. This also applies to the revised TPP that entered into force a few weeks ago. The definition of what is a non-market economy is what is defined as a non-market economy in national trade remedy laws. And so for the United States, it means insisting on the U.S. position which China has opposed in the WTO. The clause in and of itself only adds new obligations with regard to notification and consultations. It says a country can withdraw if it doesn't like the terms of a deal that a partner negotiates with a non-market economy, but that right already exists in the WTO and in free trade agreements through the withdrawal clause. In actuality, what this clause really is, and I'll close on this point because time is short, this is a political signal and a political threat from the United States to China and other non-market economies. There are no new obligations, but there is the political pressure for U.S. trading partners not to enter into free trade negotiations with China. So this is a problem that could spread and deepen and further poison the multilateral trading system unless we can find a way of working together and developing more effective dispute settlement procedures in the WTO and more effective rules that allow those dispute settlement processes to work in an objective and efficient manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent speeches. Now we have about 10 more minutes for discussion. So any questions or comments? Okay, please.
Fred Bergstedt here at the Peterson Institute. I'd like to pursue with Mr. Liu Feng some of the things he was saying, particularly in his last slide, when he remarked that China would need to make some significant changes in its own practices in conformity with WTO reforms to put some new disciplines on state subsidies, technology transfer, and the like. What's your prediction? Do you think China will be willing to do that, in part, as you said, to bring the current trade war under control and to avoid a further deterioration in the relationship we have now? I think you're exactly right to say these WTO reforms must be a central part of resolving the current crisis as well as dealing with systemic problems down the road. What's your expectation? Do you think China understands that it needs to make those changes for its own interests to avoid a deterioration of the trading system? Do you think China will move in those directions?
Of course, my prediction is not important. It's a humble personal prediction. I think at least 2 points. Number one, I think, personally, I think China will pursue more reform. Actually, China has actively pursued reform, in all 40 years, or even in recent years. Of course, different opinions existed, and towards how fast or whether it is too slow for the reform. But the objective observation where, and tell us, reform are still there, a lot of progress in certain areas. So in other words, responding to your question, I think China certainly will further pursue reform, but mainly or fundamentally on the basis of China's own interest. Actually, China's, and ambition is modernize China's economy, in, for example, and 15 or, and the second century. Yes, so I think in order to deliver that kind of result, China still need to reform to, raise the standard of the market economic system to even higher standard. So that is the first point. Second point is, it is always the basic principle of Chinese official policy stance. We should mutually, respect trading partners' concern or requests, mutually weigh. So in other words, now you can see the last year events regarding China-US relationship, as well as not only we discussed, have the opportunity to discuss, some concerns not only raised by states, but also shared by some other developed countries as trading partners, important trading partners with China. China, of course, need to consider that. China is considering that. So in order, to solve all these kind of issues, I think bilateral talks, which are underway right now, is a channel, to proceed all these kind of negotiations. But also, I think a multilateral framework will have, some other advantage or merit to address these kind of concerns. Very important, the concern is not only one way. It's not only concern raised by developed countries vis-a-vis US or China, but also China's concern or China's requests, against states and other developed countries, or joint concern of the future of the multilateral rules. I think in that context, I think China's reform, potential reform agenda, also have implications in this context. Thank you.
Okay, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Phil Eskelin with the Korea Economic Institute. I was fascinated with your presentation, Jeff, on the number of times the U.S. has submitted cases to the WTO and affecting China. But it's also maybe part of a larger issue in terms of skepticism of international organizations. I mean, the Trump administration is also getting us out of the International Postal Union, for example. So, but I think to help the case for, WTO reform, do you happen to know how many times the U.S. position has won in the WTO? It doesn't have to be a case that went all the way to adjudication, but maybe China changed its policy before it got to that point. do you know what percentage of times that we have won at the WTO? Thank you.
I don't have the percentage right in front of me, but the U.S. usually wins when it brings a case, and winning often is early on when the country agrees that it's violated and then brings its practices into compliance. The problem the United States has had is some of the rulings against it when countries have challenged U.S. practices, particularly on anti-dumping and countervail. That has led to a lot of concern about the judicial. That's a major area of concern with regard to judicial overreach.
Brian with China Xinhua News Agency. I want to ask two questions related to the current China-U.S. trade negotiations. I think the U.S. Chamber has made a recommendation that any bilateral commitments during the negotiation, particularly on the IP technology transfer, should be incorporated into the multilateral context. It means it could be developed as the future WTO rules. What's your take on that? And secondly, the U.S. negotiators have emphasized that enforcement is key for the current U.S.-China trade negotiations. I'm wondering, what do you think, what kind of enforcement mechanism the two countries could agree on during the negotiations for any U.S.-China trade deal? Thank you.
Actually, the current situation of the China-U.S. talk, and we wish to know more. Actually, we don't know the concrete information. Actually, yesterday and today, and this morning, we visited several think tanks, in D.C., try to get more information about that. Also, yesterday we had the privilege to meet with one official from USTR. We also want to gain some information, but it seems to me all the responses we get from this official is all diplomatic language. There's a little concrete information. But as an observer and a researcher, of course, we all know that all the issues may likely involved in the discussed or debated or negotiated in the talk. Number one is the trade imbalance issues. So whether China willing to purchase more, and goods or services from this country to narrow the gap. I think China indicated in last May already, as well as by Xi Jinping's Boao speech on April last year. China wish, and to make some kind of the concession in this regard. Another issue, of course, is China's market access. China also indicated, actually last year, China did a lot of things to further opening up in a lot of sectors, especially in financial sector. Then there's 4 issues highlighted in the section 301, report, as well as, this SOE issue, subsidy issue we discussed just now. All these issues, I think, is more complicated, related to some extent, to varying extent, to structural, reform in China. I think maybe these areas, China and the U.S., will have a tough job, to reach some kind of consensus. So we're all anxious to see what will happen in the coming months. Thank you.
Okay. I was going to say just one quick point on that, just to show how difficult this issue is. If you take the issue of subsidies rules, for example, in the WTO, there are a list of some types of subsidies that are banned, but many that aren't. And if you're going to win a dispute on these kinds of things, you have to show what's called adverse effects, which is basically injury, right? That you're actually suffering from these things. But you have to show evidence of that, and you have to show this takes a while sometimes to actually play out, right? It may take a couple of years before the really negative impacts begin to show up, but of course that can actually have long-term effects if the subsidies are so large that there's first mover advantage involved and things like that. And so there's some questions out there now when writing new rules. Should be the case that you don't need to show adverse effects, that you could just ban certain types of subsidies outright, and if countries are found to have used those, you can take immediate action. And then what the immediate action might be is a separate question. What's the remedy? Would it be, the prospective threat of tariffs if the failure, if they don't remove these subsidies, or is there some retrospective remedy that you might, look to for past harm that's been caused? In any case, these are the difficult issues that you have to get into the details of when you're trying to confront, how to address these big systemic concerns.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome you to attend our CF40 and the PIIE China Economic Forum tomorrow morning in New York or the last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Haibing. Thank you, Chad, Feng, and Jeff. Just to echo Haiming, the partnership between CF40 and PIIE remains strong. We believe we're offering genuine discussion, substantive discussion and exchange. I'm grateful to CF40 for bringing so many of their good people to be with us. Again, tomorrow in New York, focused on the Jingshan Report and financial reform in China with Huang Yiping, Nicholas Veron, Guo Tong, and others. That will be on the web as well. And in May, we will be getting together for our 8th annual, hard to believe, joint CF40 PIIE conference in Beijing. That's invitation only, but if you're really interested, let me know. Finally, just a reminder again, after tomorrow, the next big event is Monday, the release of Nicholas Lardy's The State Strikes Back here at PIIE. Thank you all very much.